Hello, Intro to IR class. Dr. Maiden here, coming from you on location. The location for this lecture is my husband's makeshift transitioning home office. So this is going to be lecture Intro to IR 5.1 on human rights. Okay, so this is Intro to IR 5.1. We're in our final section here, human security. We've only got a couple of lectures where we're going to be looking at human security. So we've transitioned from very large section all about international security and all the different facets of that. We're looking at economic security. That's what we've been doing in section 4, and now we're transitioning section 5 into human security for these last couple of lectures. So we're going to start as we did with most of them. We're going to be doing where in the world, all right? So a couple of pictures that I'm popping up here. Where in the world am I talking about with these pictures, all right? So this is an interesting one when we're talking about human rights. Again, probably you could hint a little bit from the pictures. This is talking about coronavirus situation that we're currently in. I don't know if you've seen in the news the idea that a lot of governments are starting to ramp up governments are starting to ramp up digital surveillance technologies in this effort to fight the COVID-19. And so a big challenge from a lot of these human rights organizations has been, is that against our rights for the government to be doing that, to be doing a wide scale scaling up of digital surveillance? There's a really big question as to whether this is going to be in violation of our human rights to do this level of scale up of surveillance technology. So with this issue in play, a host of human rights organizations, over 100 organizations, from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Access Now, Privacy International, they issued a joint statement this week talking about how governments need to show leadership in tackling the pandemic by respecting human rights when using and accessing and manipulating digital technologies to track and monitor people. Okay, so there are at least 24 countries that are undertaking telecommunication location tracking, and at least 14 countries are using applications for contact tracing to do quarantine enforcement. This includes everything from China, Russia, the US, UK, and I would love to know your thoughts on this. What do you think about this? The government's use of ramping up digital surveillance to combat the pandemic. Is it against your rights for them to do that, for them to access your information and see where you're traveling, right? Comment down below if you have a thought about that. So what we're doing in this lecture, this is the evolution of human rights. We're going to trace the 3 broad categories of human rights first and just outline what they are. And then we're going to do very briefly, basically like literally a snapshot history here of the evolution of how these rights came into being. So the first one, if you're following along on the slides, is individual rights. So individual rights are rights that individuals have simply because they are human beings, and they are not to be violated by governments. So you can think of, we've talked about in previous lectures, a lot of these. We've talked about it in the international law lecture. This came up quite a bit, even if we go all the way back to our initial section that we did on theories of IR. This came up a lot, particularly in the liberalism lecture. This idea of these being called first generation human rights, because these were the rights that became solidified in the first generation of democracies. So if we're thinking the American Revolution, the French Revolution, really solidifying these concepts, if you go back to, our US history, things like life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, right? Codified into our Constitution, codified into our Declaration of Independence. We deserve these rights and we are not getting them from the British government, so we will separate and establish a new government where we do have these rights guaranteed and protected for our citizens. So first generation comes from this idea of this first wave, this first generation of democratic governments that had a protection of these individual rights as the foundation of their governments, okay, of their societies. So freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, right to due process, right to own property. All of these things are these first generation fundamental human rights that no government should be allowed to violate at any point in time. And they are inalienable. They are specific to us. Every person has them by nature of being a person. The second one then, the second set of rights are called societal rights or second generation human rights. So societal rights are largely material and economic rights that apply society-wide. So you can think of things like right to education, employment, shelter, healthcare. And this, if we're going back to some of the lectures that we've done where we talked about liberalism and we talked about Marxism, second generation human rights emerged very strongly as a reaction, largely a Marxist reaction to what happened to people's living and working conditions during the Industrial Revolution. And so it was this idea that, okay, having the right to vote is clearly not enough to promote human flourishing. Having the right of freedom of movement and the right to work, that is not enough. If in this capitalist system, if you're thinking to Industrial Revolution, if you have these children in factories and people working 17-hour days and, you know, having virtually no life, no ability to pursue education, no ability to have reliable access to healthcare, you saw this idea of, okay, individual rights in terms of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, that's not enough. There is more here that governments should be protecting, namely societal rights. So by the mid 20th century, most countries had begun adopting things like social programming. So they were adopting large-scale public employment schemes, social security schemes, public education. So these second-generation human rights of like, oh, I have a right to education, can often come after I have a right to be alive, okay? Especially if you're in a country like DRC where you might have violent conflict that is more pressing to handle to promote people's first generation human rights than second generation human rights. The third one then is group rights. These are considered third generation human rights, group rights. And these are rights that need to be protected from unpopular or minority groups. These are the rights of the unpopular, the minorities, and they need to be protected from the oppression of the majority. So this is very much a response to what happened in World War II. The repression, the mass slaughter of minority groups, Jews, Roma peoples, homosexuals, and this idea that there is the third generation then, this third wave of human rights saying there is such a thing as group rights too. So there are individual rights by nature of being human, we have them. There are societal rights by nature of us living in society together. We need to protect and promote certain rights. And then within these societies, there are groups of us that are separate and distinct, that are unique, that have different needs. And we have to be protecting those rights, those needs. So you can think of a couple of different things that have happened. A big one being things like abolishing race-based oppression. So whether you can say we've actually completed that mission in some place like the US with the US Civil Rights Movement, but that was very much a movement to correct race-based oppression. Something like the ending of apartheid in Southern Africa, very similar, right? An attempt to correct this, to correct and promote, in particular, third generation human rights. Confronting ethnic and religious-based oppression is also something that is ongoing across many countries. We've mentioned throughout the semester a number of different cases of that. One that comes to mind for me is something like the current Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, in Burma. Okay. Another one that has been central to this, and maybe you'll notice from the slide here, is promoting women's rights globally. Women is kind of their own group category that is consistent across all peoples everywhere. And it's really focusing on promoting women's rights condemning gender-based violence, in particular condemning violence against women. So the book highlights some examples of some of the challenges that we've faced as a global community, things like honor killings, female genital cutting, the trafficking of women, particularly women and girls are trafficked to a much higher degree than men and boys are. But these are just some of the challenges that thanks to, or not thanks is the wrong word, as a result of globalization, we have had this challenge of now issues that were unique to different areas, something like honor killings, have spilled over, and you're having rates of honor killings in Australia and the UK and the US, and we're having to address these types of issues as well. One thing that tends to come up in particular with this one, this third generation human rights, group rights, is this challenge of what we call cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is this idea that it's all relative, right? Particularly when it comes to culture. So if you want to do something like, scarification, a lot of cultures around the world practice scarification. So it's where you purposefully will break open your own skin. A lot of times they'll do things like on the face, like different African ethnic groups. They might do scarification on the face. Sometimes they'll even do something where they're putting something underneath the skin so the scars will become raised. So it's this idea of, look, if you want to do that, it's not my thing. I'm not going to do it, but I'm not going to say boo on you for doing it. I just have to understand that that's something that you want to do. A big challenge becomes with things like, in particular, honor killings. A lot of people will say something like, it's my culture. It is my culture. It is my right to practice honor killing. And so that becomes a big challenge where we say, okay, to what extent do we believe cultural relativism should remain intact? And to what extent do we say, okay, no, I understand that your culture is your culture, but you are infringing on the human rights of another individual, and that can't happen, regardless of your culture. So that becomes the challenge here of where do you draw the line? Where do you stop it with some of these practices that could be looped under cultural relativism and say, your thing's your thing, my thing's my thing, or I'm allowed to opt into this. A big one again would be like male circumcision, because in a lot of cultures, it's not actually practiced on babies the way that it is to the extent in the US. It's consenting men. You often are like 14 to 16 in a lot of cultures, and you opt into doing it. Now, the extent to which you feel like it's a forced choice, and we've talked about in this class before, I know, the idea of a forced choice, it could be that the societal pressure on you is so great that you feel like, I can't not opt in. I will undergo this procedure because people will think, well, what's wrong with him? There's something wrong with him if he doesn't participate. And the extent to which that's true varies across the different areas where this is still practiced. But it just becomes the challenge of, if I'm a consenting adult and I opt into an unnecessary procedure, or I opt into scarification, I opt into genital cutting, is something wrong with that if I'm opting into it? Okay. If you have any comments about that, I know this is really hard to do. I wish we could be in class to be having a discussion about this. That would be so much more interesting than what I'm doing here. Yeah, I'm getting off track. We're gonna pause. Let's pause and we'll come back together here. So those were the three groups: individual rights, societal rights, group rights. We're gonna pause, regroup, and we'll be back together to talk just briefly about where this all came from, the evolution of these rights. Okay, we'll be right back together. Okay, so I wasn't expecting this, but apparently during this break, I got magically turned into some kind of vulture puppet. Hold please, I'm gonna try and turn back into myself. Okay, sorry y'all, that was super lame. I am seriously running out of shticks. I'm running out of things to do, and this is all I had. I had my son's creepy bird, vulture, eagle puppet. We'll say it's an osprey, right? Hello, what's our thing's name? Osborne. No, that's not it. Osborne the osprey. Okay, whatever, we're moving on. So we talked about the three groupings of human rights, and we'll just talk very briefly. We've actually touched on this in a couple of our other lectures, so I'm not going to harp on this for a really long time. The idea of this human rights regime. And so it's very much rooted in not only the international law lecture that we did, where we talked about the evolution of international law, but kind of pair that with the lecture that we did talking about the rise in international organizations. So if we think of law and international organizations and kind of bring those together, and then the third piece being the evolution from Westphalian system to Neo-Westphalian system. Okay, so we are now in the Neo-Westphalian system. Those three things together, so rise in international law, rise in international organizations, and a fundamental transition from Westphalian to Neo-Westphalian conceptions of the state, where the state is not as important as it once was. All three of these things that we've covered all semester really play into the rise of the human rights regime and what we can think of now as more of like the human security era, as opposed to state security that we had been in for such a long time. Okay, so the book goes over lots and lots and lots and lots of conventions that happened. So starting in 1948, you had something like the Convention on Genocide. Same year, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was codifying everything that we've been talking about, really building out and codifying these three forms of rights that people have. By the 1960s, you had the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And on the slide, if you're looking, I also included, just so that you can see how it just kept trickling down as the international community found its new subject area to get interested in. So racial discrimination in the 1960s, obviously, because we were dealing with apartheid and the civil rights movement. Elimination on all forms of discrimination against women in the 80s. Convention against torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment in the 80s. Convention on the Rights of the Child, migrant workers, protection of migrant workers and their families in the 2000s. We can be thinking about, with everything we've been talking about with globalization and trends and how things are changing, everything we just did with the economic security lecture, where we were talking about the rise in migrant work, the rise in precarious, unprotected, underpaid work. The fact that all these companies in developed countries transitioning their work out into developing countries, you have challenges that must be met in terms of migrant workers and their families. Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Okay. And to this, I think it would be very interesting. The book highlights it too, and I actually do kind of a whole section where we talk about it in another class. I feel pretty strongly that I think the next convention that we will see, an international convention that will be codifying the rights of individuals. I wonder if you can guess it. Comment down below if you think you know what it is, what you think the next big UN sanctioned convention is going to be, covering what particular group of individuals. I'll wait. Okay, so I think it's going to be the LGBTQ community. All right, we're not quite there yet that they're ready to have that convention, but if we look at a big, massive convention that's going to codify a very strong set of rights and roles and responsibilities, I think that's going to be the next group up, and the book hints at that as well, that's what we're going to see. All right, so obviously we can see from here not only international movement, but then the book also goes into a bunch of different regional conventions and human rights declarations, the African Union, the European Union, each codifying laws perhaps a little bit differently, or just taking international laws and recreating them at the regional level and putting more enforcement mechanisms behind them. And then nationally as well, governments kind of recommitting to protecting these rights for individuals, okay? And so that what we see then is a fundamental shift. If we're looking kind of the period from the end of the Cold War to now, really starting at the turn of the century. We made it through the 90s, which was a very devastating time in the world in terms of genocidal activity that was happening around the world. And so there's this fundamental shift in the 21st century now to human security. And we've been talking a lot about it. I'm getting a little jumbled because I've been talking about it in all 3 of my classes now. Human security. And it's this idea that security of people, not territory, is what matters. It was first set out in 1994. And so it's the idea of, if you promote human security, it will necessarily promote the economic security you're looking for. And the economic security can also promote the international security that you're looking for. So we've spent this whole semester doing most of our work on international security. And now that we're at the end, what we're doing is saying, okay, look, we've learned through this process that actually if we focus on this thing that we're only giving 3 lectures to, this thing can give you the turnaround you're looking for across all these other things, right? But that's where we're at. We're tracing it logically and historically. That's where we're at, is the world saying, okay, maybe we're onto something with this idea of people mattering more than territory, all right? So the big thing that has emerged then and is very, very strongly being pushed in the 21st century in terms of human rights is what we call the R2P agenda. And that's what we'll end with for this lecture. The R2P agenda, responsibility to protect. And it's the idea, this normative idea, again, so very liberal, if we're thinking across our theories, very liberal idea, the normative idea that states have a responsibility to protect their citizens from avoidable harm. And if they cannot or will not do so, the international community has a responsibility, a duty to intervene. So this was codified by the UN General Assembly in 2005. A big challenge here has been, all right, we cannot trust individual states. We're doing this new, it's Neo-Westphalian, this new system where states are not as autonomous as they used to be. They are not as sovereign as they used to be in our new system. So that if you are harming your citizens, we have a responsibility to intervene. And we've talked about this in some of our other lectures when we've talked about humanitarian intervention as a form of keeping the peace and promoting security. So I won't harp on it too long, but just to understand that this is kind of where we're at now. So if we're tracing all the way through liberal ideas going back to Plato and Aristotle about rights of man, going through to Immanuel Kant and rights of man, and we just keep moving forward. American Revolution, French Revolution, solidifying those first generation rights, then Industrial Revolution, Marxism coming along and saying we need second generation human rights, third generation human rights being born out of the world, out of World War II and the devastation of that round of genocidal activity. Third generation human rights, to this point now where we're at saying human security is more important than state security. Humans are more important than territory. We have a responsibility to protect humans within a state, even if that state will not do it. We will intervene and we will take care of people because people are what matter, okay? So that's, like I said, a very quick, a snappy shot here. This is a short lecture to be throwing all this information at you. If you have any questions, please let me know. Comment down below if you have any ideas about anything. And I will see you, the bird, Ozzy, I think that's it, right? Ozzy and I will see you later. Bye, guys.